Hello again. Welcome back to our discussion about the Constitution. The emphasis is on conflict and compromise. This is the second video lecture and the second discussion we're going to have about the Constitution. Last time, if you'll remember, we talked about the Articles of Confederation, the things that led up to the Revolutionary War, why the Founding Fathers created a very weak and decentralized federal government, and the problems that that created. Today we're going to talk about the U.S. Constitution, our current Constitution, and how that addressed some of the problems created by the Articles of Confederation. And also we're going to talk about the structure and the powers given to the federal government in the U.S. Constitution. So first of all, let's back up a second and remember that the Founding Fathers and the American colonies rebelled against a monarchy. And they felt like a monarchy was not a good system of government because it was too much power invested in one person, the king. So that was too much government centralized in one person. They crafted the Articles of Confederation to try to address that. They created a weak central government so that states would have more power as a decentralized system. But they found that that was too little government. They needed a stronger federal government to take over some of the powers and to do things on behalf of all the states at the same time. So the U.S. Constitution was actually written to provide more power and create a stronger federal government. However, the powers were enumerated, meaning they were written down and specified, and the powers were intended to be limited. So yes, the federal government was stronger than the Articles of Confederation, but it was not unlimited power that was intended to be given to the federal government. The powers that were given were very specific, outlined in the Constitution, and anything that was not written down as a power given to Congress or the President or the Supreme Court was not something that the federal government did. All the powers that were not given to the federal government, the idea was that it was left for the states. Those were powers that the states had. This distinction between federal power that's enumerated and limited and all other powers being reserved to the states is what we call federalism, and we're going to talk about that next week. So the U.S. Constitution, again, addressed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation by creating a stronger national government. Specifically, it created a national government that was able to levy taxes to pay for things like the military, the national debt, the postal service. It also created a national currency. Remember last time we talked about how each state had its own currency. The U.S. Constitution eliminated that and gave to the federal government the power to create a national currency that all states would use. They also gave the power to negotiate treaties on behalf of all the states to the federal government. So now treaties would apply to all states. You would not have one state with one treaty with France, for instance, and another state with a completely different treaty. And finally, we talked about Shays' Rebellion briefly. The federal government had much more power to raise an army and to provide for and to keep the national peace. The U.S. Constitution, let's talk about the structure of it, how it is organized as a textual document. It is divided into articles, and each article deals with a distinct area of government. So, for example, Article 1 deals with Congress. It creates Congress, it gives the power to Congress, it specifies, how all the things related to Congress. Article 2 deals with the presidency, creates the executive branch, and defines the power of the presidency. Article 3 creates the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court, and the federal judicial system. Article 4 talks about things related to the states. Article 5 deals with how to amend the Constitution, and Article 6 through 7 is other stuff. Now notice that so far the words on this slide are not in red. That's because we're only going to focus on these three articles. We're going to focus on the three articles that enumerate powers to the federal government and particularly to each one of the three major branches, Congress, presidency, and the judiciary. So we're going to talk about each one of these and a couple of powers. It would take too long to go through all of the different powers that each branch of government has. But let's start with the legislative branch. Again, Article 1 lays out the two houses of Congress, the terms in office, how and who can run for office and how long they serve, those sort of things. We start out by recognizing it's a bicameral Congress. Bi means two, cameral means house. It simply means that there are two houses in Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Why a bicameral Congress? Why not just have a Congress like they did under the Articles of Confederation? Well, the reason is we call this the Great Compromise. It was actually a compromise between large states and small states. In the House of Representatives, the seats are based on state population. Every 10 years we have a census where they count the total number of people in the country, including how many people live in each one of the states. And the states are awarded seats in the House of Representatives in proportion to the size of their population. So California has a very large population, so does Texas. They have a lot of seats in Congress. Wyoming, sadly, has a very small population. We only have one seat in Congress. We only have one seat in the House of Representatives. So larger states in the House of Representatives have more power. And the representatives serve 2-year terms, very short terms. The Senate, on the other hand, was created to give more influence to small states. Every state has 2 seats in the Senate. So even though Wyoming is a small state and California is a big state, both Wyoming and California have 2 seats in the U.S. Senate. So again, this is a way to have equal representation for all of the states, in contrast to the House of Representatives, where you have more representation for larger states. And senators serve 6-year terms, a longer term in office, so, more distance between elections. And again, this was a compromise between the large and the small states. Obviously, the large states wanted a single body of Congress, like under the Articles of Confederation, and they wanted the seats to be allocated by the size of the population. The small states didn't like that. They feared that the big states would dominate policymaking at the federal level, especially since they were giving more power to the federal government. They wanted equal representation for all the states, like they had under the Articles of Confederation. So the two sides got together and they compromised and said, okay, well, the large states will have the House of Representatives, the small states will have the Senate, and thus we have a bicameral Congress. So let's talk about Article 2, which designates powers and creates the executive branch. Interestingly, this is, for me personally, this is one of the most interesting debates that the Founding Fathers had. There was actually debate about what the head executive would be. In some countries, like Great Britain right now, you have a parliamentary system where the parliament chooses a prime minister, and the prime minister can be removed by the parliament. In other areas, other countries, you have a presidential system where the president is elected independent of the legislature and therefore operates independently, is not beholden to the legislator for his or her job. Alexander Hamilton, one of the famous founding fathers, actually wanted a king. Did not want a president or a prime minister, wanted a king, and wanted the king elected for life. If something happened to the king and, died, for instance, then there would be an election for another king, and that king would serve his entire life. Others wanted a much weaker executive branch, similar to the colonial governors at the time. They did not have a lot of power and were more reliant on the legislature. So the solution to this was actually the Electoral College. This is one of the more archaic aspects of our body politic. And basically, the votes in the Electoral College are based on the number of representatives for states in Congress. For example, Wyoming has a very small population. We only have one seat in the House of Representatives, but we have 2 seats in the Senate. So 1 House of Representatives and 2 senators equals 3 Electoral College votes. So another interesting aspect of the Electoral College is that technically states are allowed to decide how these electors are selected. You may not have realized that when you vote for the presidency, you're actually not directly voting for the presidency. You're voting for electors who then go sometime in January, I believe, and they vote for the presidency. Now, it happens that all states today use elections. So whichever candidate gets the most votes, let's say in Wyoming, will get all of those electors at the Electoral College when they vote for the president. And so for most presidential elections, the person who wins the popular vote nationwide will win the presidency. There have been a few instances where that has not happened. 2000 was most recent. But originally, states were allowed to decide how to choose that. You could have had, for instance, the state legislature would get together and say, okay, we're going to give our electoral college votes to this candidate. And the public at the time would have had no say over that. Today, again, all states use elections, and so it's a more streamlined process than it was. So what happens if no candidate gets a majority of electoral college votes? Well, the House of Representatives ends up deciding it. That is a very long, complicated process that we're not going to talk about. But if you're interested in seeing just how weird presidential elections could get if nobody wins the majority of the electoral college, look into that. That gets into some very interesting processes. So again, I want to go back to this theme of compromise. The two sides, one side wanted a completely independent executive, Hamilton wanted a king, and Madison and others wanted more of a parliamentary system, a weak executive who was more, beholden to the Congress or the legislature, like a parliamentary system. The compromise was that they had an independent executive, meaning that the president was independently elected. The president is not selected by Congress, as would be the case in a parliamentary system. And the president has veto power. So if the Congress passes a law and the president doesn't like it, the president can veto it and block that bill from becoming a law. And to overturn the veto, it requires 2/3 supermajority in Congress. So 2/3 of Congress have to agree to override the president's veto in order to get around that. That rarely happens. You could not get 2/3 of Congress to agree on mom and apple pie, for instance. The peach farmers would be upset and fathers would rebel. I don't know. But the point is, it's very hard to to overrule or override a president's veto, which gives him a lot more independence from the Congress. And the president is very hard to remove. There is a process for impeachment, but it is very difficult to actually remove the president from office. Again, requires supermajority vote in the Senate. It's very rarely happened throughout our history. So the compromise was that, yes, in a nod towards Hamilton, they created this independent executive, but they limited the powers of their new presidency. The president, for instance, cannot even declare war. Now, the reality of the situation in terms of president and foreign policy has changed dramatically over the past 60 years. We'll talk about this at the end of the semester when we talk about the executive branch. But technically, the president is not allowed to declare war. Only Congress can declare war. The president also needs the Senate's approval for a couple of things. He needs their approval for any ambassadors and treaties. If the president wants to negotiate a treaty, say, with Mexico or China, he has to get the Senate to approve that treaty. If the president wants to appoint an ambassador to, let's say, Great Britain or Spain, the Senate has to approve that. The Senate also has to approve all executive appointments, and this includes the Supreme Court. The president gets to nominate anybody he wants when there's a Supreme Court vacancy, but the Senate has to approve that. And right now, we have a very interesting conflict between the president and the Senate over this very thing. Justice Antonin Scalia recently passed away, and his vacancy on the court was attempted to be filled by President Obama. President Obama nominated Merrick Garland to fill Justice Scalia's seat. The Senate, however, has rejected that and refuses to even hold a hearing for Merrick Garland to replace that seat. Their argument is that the public should have a chance to decide and weigh in on the decision, and so therefore, with a presidential election coming up, the next president should get to make that choice. I'm not getting into that debate, but only it highlights the limitation of the presidency, that even though the president gets to nominate people for the Supreme Court, his power is still severely limited by the Senate, who has to agree to it. So that was a compromise between the Hamilton and Madison factions, or the two sides. Hamilton wanted a strong independent executive that had the majority of power in the federal government. Madison wanted Congress and the legislature to have the majority of power, so they compromised by creating a presidency that was independent and could not be easily removed, but also severely limiting his or her power. And finally, that brings us to Article 3, which talks about the judiciary. It lays out the Supreme Court, how Supreme Court justices are appointed, and how long they serve, and other things. Hopefully you know this, and we already talked about it, the president appoints or nominates justices to the Supreme Court. Those nominees then go to the Senate for a hearing and a vote, and the Senate must approve of that nominee before the person becomes a justice on the Supreme Court. An interesting little side note is that the lower courts are actually created by Congress. The only court that is in the U.S. Constitution is the Supreme Court. And all of the lower courts at the federal level are actually creations of Congress. Hypothetically, if Congress wanted to, they could eliminate the entire federal judiciary except for the Supreme Court. It would never happen, but it just I think that's an interesting side note. Finally, judicial review. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to overturn federal laws. If Congress and the president pass a law that they deem unconstitutional, the Supreme Court will strike it down. They will nullify the law. They will basically say, this is no longer law. This bill that you passed is not the law of the land. Interestingly, this was not part of the original Constitution, and moreover, there was strong debate, strong conflict between the Founding Fathers about this issue of judicial review. You'll notice a pattern here between disputes between Hamilton and Madison. When we talk about the origins of the political party system, you'll see that these two characters, that the conflict between them actually created the current political parties that we have. At the time, there were no political parties, but this conflict between Hamilton and Madison, also Thomas Jefferson, sort of formed a lot of the early structures of our government. So back to judicial review. Alexander Hamilton argued that the Constitution implies that the Supreme Court has the power to overturn federal laws, that judicial review is implicit in the Constitution. James Madison, his argument was that the Supreme Court is unelected. They're appointed by the President and the Senate, and an unelected branch does not have the authority to overturn laws that are written and passed by representatives elected by the people. So he viewed the Supreme Court as largely undemocratic and was not comfortable with them overturning the laws. Hamilton supported more power to the federal government and argued that the Constitution obviously implies that the Supreme Court has this authority. It was decided by a Supreme Court case, a famous one known as Marbury versus Madison. Madison, by the way, is the same James Madison that we've been talking about. Madison lost. The Supreme Court ruled that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. So that's how we now have one of the strongest powers of the Supreme Court, is it came from the Supreme Court ruling in a case involving one of the Founding Fathers in a dispute with another Founding Father that they indeed did have this power. So those are the three branches of government, and the main points that we're going to cover from Article 1, 2, and 3. There's a lot more in these articles. There are a lot of powers enumerated to each one of the branches that we're not going to cover. I just want to highlight a few things with each one. Let's turn and talk about this larger point about compromise. which is the main point to take away. The specific debates that we've been talking about are very important. You'll need to know them. But the main point, the main takeaway point is this. There was conflict among the Founding Fathers. I think there's an unfortunate myth that the Founding Fathers got together and the clouds opened up, the rays of sunshine beamed down upon them, and the Constitution was born. That everybody agreed and created this brilliant document, and that's what we had from the very beginning. And the reality could not be more different. The Founding Fathers deeply disagreed. They had very strong differences of opinion and differences in values about what they wanted the federal government to be like. However, they also had a pragmatic side. They were pragmatic enough to understand that they had to resolve the conflicts, and the conflicts they would resolve by compromising with one another. So again, I think it proves that you can't always get what you want, but if you get the point behind my silly little reference to the Rolling Stones. All kidding aside, this is, I think, one of the more interesting and one of the more important parts about understanding the Constitution is how much of what we have today that we just have always assumed was intended by the Founding Fathers was really a byproduct of compromises they were making with one another. So the two sides got together, they hugged it out. Let's walk through a partial list of the major compromises that came about through the Constitution writing process. First was the conflict between majority rule and minority rights. The Founding Fathers wanted a democratic society where the majority would would decide who would be the representatives, and majorities in Congress would pass bills. So they wanted the majority to have the say over policy and governance. But they did not want an out-of-control majority trampling on the rights of minority. And so they wanted to try to balance majority rule with minority rights. And they did this in a very interesting way. This is a famous separation of powers. You have a presidency with certain powers. You have a Congress with other powers. So we have this fragmented government system. Even in Congress, you have two houses, both of which have to agree to legislation before it can become law. So not just different branches, but within the same branch, different bodies and different houses. And the Founding Fathers believed that it is unlikely that any one faction would gain complete control over all of the different institutions at the federal level. It is very unlikely that a majority would be able to control the presidency and the Senate and the House all at the same time. They also created a federal system, which further divided control. So not only is there separation of powers where each branch of government has unique powers that are specific to it and exclusive to the other branches, but the federal government as a whole only has some powers, and the rest of the powers are left to the states. So that means that even if, on the unlikely chance that a faction can gain complete control over the federal government, well, the federal government is limited in what it can do according to the views of the Founding Fathers, and therefore you don't have to worry about a majority faction dominating the entire government. They may be able to dominate the federal government, but they still are unlikely to be able to control the states as well. So this fragmentation across different institutions at the federal level and between the federal and the state government, they thought would protect minority rights. And finally, they had what they called the size principle, which was James Madison in particular wrote in one of the Federalist Papers talking about how America is a large and diverse society, and no group has an absolute majority. So no one group can gain a majority status because basically everybody is their own minority of some kind. So what we call pluralism, just this diversity in society, inherently protects minority rights. So that was how the Founding Fathers tried to compromise between those who advocate majority rule and those who feared and wanted to protect minority rights. A second set of compromises involved small versus large states. We've already talked about this, but I wanted to go through it one more time. Basically, they needed to prevent large states from dominating over small states. And so they came up with the Great Compromise, the bicameral Congress, which is actually sometimes known as the Connecticut Proposal. That's not really important. Just understand what the Great Compromise was, which is a bicameral Congress. A third compromise in a third area where there's conflict between the Founding Fathers and where they reached compromise was between legislative and executive power. Again, remember, Hamilton wanted a king. He wanted a strong executive branch that would dominate the federal government. Others were not as keen on that idea. And still others actually wanted multiple executive positions. What that means is that in Wyoming, for example, the governor is elected, but also the Secretary of State is elected that's separately from the governor. The president appoints the U.S. Secretary of State. And so at the federal level, the Secretary of State is hired by the president. But in Wyoming, the Secretary of State is a completely independent office that is elected separately from the governor. And some of the Founding Fathers liked this idea for the federal government. Obviously, they didn't get that, but it just shows you the range of beliefs and ideas about executive power. So they came to a compromise. The compromise was, again, a single independent executive with limited powers checked by the legislature. And what that means is that the House, the Senate, and the President all have to agree on legislation before it becomes law. So that requires negotiation and compromises, especially when different parties have a majority in different branches. As we do right now, where Congress, both houses of Congress, Republicans have a majority, but the president is a Democrat. So they have to, in order to pass any legislation, they have to negotiate and compromise with one another. One of the major areas of conflict between the Founding Fathers was the amount of national power versus state and local power. Remember that the Articles of Confederation gave very little power to the federal government. The new Constitution created a stronger federal government with a lot more power than it had under the Articles of Confederation. This was controversial. Not everybody agreed with this. So the compromise was federalism, where they had this limited enumerated powers to the federal government and all other powers were left to states. We're going to spend a good part of next week talking about the details and specifics of federalism. So we'll leave that off for now. But again, I just wanted to kind of walk through how much the U.S. Constitution is influenced by the pragmatic nature of the Founding Fathers. This is actually one of the more interesting things is that the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they supported the idea of a stronger federal government. But a group who opposed it, who actually wanted a federal government more similar to the Articles of Confederation, they called themselves the Anti-Federalists. And one of the things they demanded was a Bill of Rights. They felt that in writing down the powers that Congress and the President have in the U.S. Constitution, they felt like there was no real check and no real prohibition against the federal government doing certain things. So what they wanted was a Bill of Rights that said explicitly, Congress cannot do this. So again, Article 1 says Congress has the power to raise an army. Congress has the power to levy taxes. The Bill of Rights says Congress does not have the power and Congress is prohibited from infringing upon free speech or freedom of religion and so forth. So you can understand this, struggle between those who were okay with a stronger federal government versus those who want to keep more power to the states and feared giving away too much power to a federal government. This is why federalism is such an interesting topic. On its face, I'll admit, it seems very dry, it seems very boring. However, the fundamental debate underlying federalism is how much power should the federal government have and how much power should the states and local governments have. That is a debate that still defines our politics. Republicans and Democrats are still arguing over this issue. It is a debate that has never stopped occurring. And so there's always eras in which one party will push for stronger national power and another party will push back against, in favor of more state power. Currently, Democrats tend to favor more federal power. Republicans tend to favor more state and local power. But again, this debate that started with the Founding Fathers continues today, several hundred years later. Finally, the last thing we're going to talk about that'll be part of the quizzes is that there's also conflict between slave and free states. Some of the states had prohibited slavery, some of them allowed slavery. So the big debate was, how do you count slaves in terms of the population? Now, why in the world would they care about this? They're slaves. Why would they want to count them as population? It has to do with the seats in Congress. Remember that the House of Representatives seats are allocated by population. So if a state has a larger population, it gets more seats. If the slave states can count slaves as population, they'll get more seats. If slaves do not count as part of the population, they get fewer seats, therefore less power in the House of Representatives. So obviously the free states did not want slaves counted as citizens. They say they're not citizens, they're slaves. Why should they count in terms of representation in the federal government? That led to the famous or infamous 3/5 compromise. What the two sides agreed to is that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person, and in terms of the allocation of congressional seats, and that put the issue of slavery off of the agenda for quite a while. The issue would, as you all know, would eventually come back and lead to the Civil War. But this was one area where the Founding Fathers recognized conflict, were able to compromise on it, and it also, by the way, shows that maybe compromise is not always a good thing. Maybe some of the things they did in forming this compromise were not noble or were not, as inspired as we would like them to be. One more of the different compromises that are, steeped in the Constitution. A couple other compromises that were made were, notice this is not in red highlighting, so I just want to mention them. In terms of the slave versus free states, the North agreed to return escaped slaves to the South. If a slave in the South escaped and they went north, where slavery was prohibited, the North would send the slave back to the owner. And in exchange for agreeing to this, the South agreed to simple majority votes on regulation of commerce and taxes. At the time, the South wanted supermajorities to raise taxes. They feared the federal government would be able to increase taxes too much and too quickly. And so they wanted an obstacle to that. They compromised, they gave up their opposition to simple majority for raising taxes and regulating commerce in exchange for the North agreeing to return escaped slaves to the South. Finally, I think ratification of the Constitution had involved a very interesting agreement. We sometimes refer to this as a gentleman's understanding. First of all, the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution, but then they had to present it to the states, and a certain number of states had to agree to adopt the Constitution. That process we call ratification. The states had to ratify the Constitution before the Constitution would become our system of government. The Anti-Federalists actually had the votes in the state legislatures to block passage of the Constitution. If they had wanted to, they could have prevented the Constitution from being ratified. However, they agreed not to do that. And what they got in exchange was a gentleman's agreement or a handshake agreement that the Federalists would introduce a Bill of Rights as the first bill in Congress. Now, this agreement is kind of remarkable if you consider the very polarized political environment we have today and the very high levels of distrust between the two parties. Basically, the Federalists could have betrayed the Anti-Federalists. Having made this agreement, the Anti-Federalists could say, okay, we're not going to block the Constitution gets ratified, and then the Federalists do not have to make good on their agreement about the Bill of Rights. There's nothing that would compel them to pass that. But there is a level of trust between the two sides. The Federalists agreed to it, and they made good on their promise. And it shows, again, the pragmatic nature of the Founding Fathers at the time. People who had very deep disagreements about the scope and nature of the federal government, and yet were able to find compromises and find ways to understand each other to reach something that they could all agree with. in the end, nobody was completely happy, right? Hamilton did not get his king, and Madison had to, be okay with an independent executive, more independent than he would have liked. So nobody got exactly what they wanted, but everybody got something, and that was good enough for them. So I think this is the legacy of the Founding Fathers, a legacy, by the way, that too often gets lost in the hyperbolic, hyper-partisan political environment that we have today, which is that conflict is inevitable. In anything related to politics or government, people are going to disagree. People are going to disagree passionately, and they're going to disagree deeply. So you're going to have conflict that are based on people's just their values and their personal beliefs. And yet, compromise is necessary to resolve that conflict. The only way you're going to resolve the conflict is if both sides get together and say, okay, well, I'll give up a little of this, and you give up a little of that. You'll give me this, and I'll give you this. And that, I think, and I'll just end this lecture with a note that is, if you take nothing else away from this class, I hope it is understanding how much of our system of government was created within an environment in which there's deep philosophical conflict about the scope and nature of government, and was created by men who were pragmatic enough to understand they have to compromise, and they were willing to compromise, even on things that they felt very deeply and passionately about. So that's all we're going to cover about the U.S. Constitution. Next week we'll talk about the Wyoming Constitution, how it's similar, how it's different, and we'll also talk about this question of federalism, and hopefully the question of federalism and the topic of federalism will be much more interesting than you think it'll be. Have a good weekend, and we'll pick this up next week.